The millionaire hired a Harvard professor, but the maid was the one who solved the problem. Welcome back to our incredible storytelling channel. Today we're taking you on an extraordinary journey through the mystical valleys of ancient Mexico, where haciendas stretched as far as the eye could see, and love bloomed in the most unexpected places. This is a tale of wisdom, courage, and the discovery that true intelligence comes from the heart, not from prestigious universities. Before we dive into this captivating romance story, make sure to hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. You won't want to miss any of our amazing stories. And please, tell us in the comments where you're joining us from today. Are you watching from Mexico City, Los Angeles, Madrid, or perhaps somewhere completely different? We absolutely love connecting with our global family of story lovers. Now, let's journey back to 1920s Mexico, to the sprawling Hacienda San Miguel, where a wealthy landowner's desperate search for answers would lead to the most unexpected love story. Chapter 1. The Desperate Search. The morning sun cast long shadows across the vast courtyards of Hacienda San Miguel, its golden rays illuminating the ancient stone walls that had stood for over 2 centuries. Don Eduardo Mendoza stood on the grand balcony of his mansion, his weathered hands gripping the wrought iron railing as he gazed out at his troubled lands. At 45, Eduardo was one of the wealthiest landowners in all of Jalisco. His hacienda encompassed thousands of acres of what had once been the most fertile farmland in western Mexico. Generations of his family had built their fortune on these lands, cultivating corn, beans, and agave that fed entire regions and produced the finest tequila in the country. But now, for the 3rd consecutive year, his crops were failing. The once lush fields had turned brown and barren, despite adequate rainfall and the same farming methods that had succeeded for decades. His workers, loyal families who had served the Mendoza family for generations, were growing desperate as their livelihoods disappeared. Don Eduardo, came a gentle voice behind him. He turned to see his longtime friend and estate manager, Miguel Santos, approaching with a concerned expression. "The Harvard professor has arrived. Dr. Harrison is waiting in your study." Eduardo nodded grimly. After exhausting every local solution, he had written to Harvard University, requesting their most brilliant agricultural scientist. The university had recommended Dr. William Harrison, a distinguished professor with degrees from both Harvard and Cambridge, whose research on soil composition had revolutionized farming techniques across the American Midwest. The study was a magnificent room lined with leather-bound books and family portraits dating back to colonial times. Dr. Harrison stood examining a large map of the hacienda, his tall, thin frame impeccably dressed in a 3-piece suit despite the Mexican heat. He was perhaps 50 years old, with silver hair and the confident bearing of a man accustomed to being the smartest person in any room. "Mr. Mendoza," Dr. Harrison said in accented Spanish, extending a firm handshake. "I've reviewed the soil samples you sent to Boston, and I must say, this is quite a fascinating case. The mineral composition suggests a complex interaction of factors that will require extensive analysis." Eduardo felt a glimmer of hope. "Doctor, my family has worked this land for 200 years. My grandfather's grandfather built this hacienda from nothing. If there's any way to save it—" Of course, Dr. Harrison interrupted, adjusting his wire-rimmed spectacles. "However, I must manage your expectations. This will require sophisticated scientific methods that may be unfamiliar to your local workers. I'll need complete control over the investigation, access to modern laboratory equipment, and perhaps most importantly, assistants who can understand complex scientific concepts." As they spoke, a soft knock came at the study door. "Adelante," Eduardo called. The door opened to reveal a young woman carrying a silver tray with coffee and pastries. She was perhaps 25, with long black hair braided traditionally, and wearing the simple white cotton dress of the household staff. But there was something striking about her, an intelligence in her dark eyes and a grace in her movement that seemed to illuminate the room. "Gracias, Paloma," Eduardo said warmly as she set down the tray. "Dr. Harrison, this is Paloma Herrera, one of our household staff." Paloma curtsied respectfully, but Eduardo noticed her eyes lingering on the agricultural maps and soil charts spread across his desk. "Con permiso, Don Eduardo," she said softly. "If I may, I noticed that the affected areas on this map correspond exactly to the sections where my grandfather said the old underground springs used to flow." Dr. Harrison looked up sharply, clearly annoyed by the interruption. "I beg your pardon, but we're discussing complex geological formations that require years of study to understand." Paloma's cheeks flushed, but she continued respectfully. "Of course, Doctor. It's just that my grandfather was the previous estate manager, and he always said the ancient springs were the secret to the land's fertility when the earthquake happened 3 years ago." "Young lady," Dr. Harrison interrupted condescendingly, Folktales and local superstitions are exactly the kind of thinking that prevents agricultural advancement. What we need here is rigorous scientific analysis, not stories passed down by people without proper education. Eduardo watched as Paloma's expression tightened, though she maintained her composure. "Forgive me," she said quietly. "I didn't mean to interrupt." She curtsied again and moved toward the door. Paloma, wait," Eduardo called. Something about her observation had struck him as significant. "What earthquake are you referring to?" "The one that damaged the old chapel, Don Eduardo. It shifted the ground throughout the valley. My grandfather always said it changed the underground water flow, but he died before he could show anyone where the new springs might be found." Dr. Harrison snorted dismissively. "Senor Mendoza, with respect, we cannot base scientific research on the ramblings of deceased groundskeepers. I propose we begin with a comprehensive soil analysis using spectroscopy and chemical testing. This will take several weeks, but it's the only reliable method." Eduardo found himself torn. Dr. Harrison's credentials were impeccable, and he had traveled thousands of miles to help. But something in Paloma's words resonated with an old memory, his own grandfather mentioning the importance of understanding the land's ancient rhythms. "Very well, Doctor," Eduardo said finally. "You have my full support for your investigation. Paloma, please ensure Dr. Harrison has everything he needs." As Paloma left the room, Eduardo couldn't shake the feeling that he was missing something important. There had been a certainty in her voice, a deep knowledge that seemed to come from something more than mere folklore. That evening, as the sun set over the hacienda, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, Eduardo walked through his failing fields. The cornstalk stood withered and brown, a heartbreaking sight for a man whose identity was so deeply tied to the land. He found Paloma in the kitchen garden behind the main house, tending to a small plot of vegetables that somehow remained lush and green, despite the problems plaguing the rest of the estate. "Your garden seems to thrive where everything else struggles," he observed. Paloma looked up, surprised to see the patron in this humble part of the grounds. "The kitchen garden has always been different, Don Eduardo. It sits exactly where my grandfather said one of the old springs used to emerge." "Tell me about your grandfather," Eduardo said, settling onto a stone bench nearby. Paloma's face softened with memory. "His name was Joaquin Herrera. He worked for your father for 30 years, and before that his father worked for your grandfather. He had a gift for understanding the land, not from books, but from listening to it, feeling its rhythms." "What did he tell you about the springs?" "That this valley was chosen by the ancient ones because of the underground rivers that flowed beneath it. 7 springs fed the land, each one connected to the others, like veins in a body. But the earthquake 3 years ago shifted the earth, and the springs found new paths." Eduardo leaned forward, intrigued, and he believed he could find these new springs. He was certain of it. He spent his last months walking the hacienda, mapping the places where the earth felt different. He said the water was still there, just flowing in new directions. Paloma's voice grew sad. "But he died before he could complete his work. Did he leave any record of his findings?" Paloma hesitated, then nodded slowly. "He drew maps, Don Eduardo, but they're not like the ones Dr. Harrison uses. They show the land the way our ancestors understood it, through story, through feel, through generations of connection." Eduardo felt his pulse quicken. "Would you show me these maps?" That night, in a small adobe house on the edge of the hacienda grounds, Paloma spread her grandfather's hand-drawn maps across a simple wooden table. By candlelight, Eduardo studied the intricate drawings that showed not just the physical features of the land, but its spiritual and historical dimensions. "Your grandfather was an artist," Eduardo said with genuine admiration. "He was a dreamer," Paloma replied, "but his dreams were always rooted in truth." As Eduardo studied the maps, he found himself studying Paloma as well. In the soft candlelight, he saw not just a servant, but a woman of remarkable depth and intelligence. The way she spoke about the land, the reverence in her voice, the careful way she handled her grandfather's precious maps. It revealed a sensitivity and wisdom that Dr. Harrison's academic credentials couldn't match. "Paloma," he said softly, "would you be willing to help me understand what your grandfather discovered, not as my employee, but as my partner in solving this mystery?" She looked up at him with surprise and something else, a spark of possibility that made Eduardo's heart race in a way he hadn't experienced in years. "I would be honored, Don Eduardo," she said. "But Dr. Harrison can pursue his scientific methods," Eduardo said firmly. "But I want to explore your grandfather's approach as well. Perhaps the answer lies not in choosing between old and new knowledge, but in finding where they intersect." As they bent over the maps together, their hands occasionally touching as they traced the paths of the ancient springs, Eduardo realized that he was embarking on more than just an agricultural investigation. He was beginning a journey that would challenge everything he thought he knew about wisdom, class, class and the nature of true understanding. And perhaps, most surprisingly of all, he was beginning to fall in love. Chapter 2. Forbidden Feelings. The following morning brought the dry heat that had become all too familiar across the valley. Eduardo rose before dawn, as was his custom, but instead of heading to his study for the usual administrative work, he found himself drawn to the kitchen gardens where Paloma tended her thriving vegetables. She was already there, kneeling among the tomato plants, her hands gentle as she examined each vine for signs of disease or pest damage. The early morning light caught the highlights in her dark hair, and Eduardo found himself pausing just to watch her work. "Buenos dias, Don Eduardo," she said without looking up, somehow sensing his presence. "Buenos dias, Paloma. You're up early. The plants tell you what they need if you listen at the right time," she replied, finally turning to face him. "The morning is when their voices are clearest." Eduardo smiled at her poetic way of describing agricultural observation. "Dr. Harrison would say that plants don't have voices." "Dr. Harrison has many degrees," Paloma said diplomatically, "but perhaps he hasn't learned to listen." They worked together for an hour, with Paloma showing Eduardo the subtle signs that indicated healthy soil versus the depleted earth that plagued the rest of his lands. Her knowledge was intuitive but remarkably accurate, gained through years of careful observation rather than textbook study. "There," she said, pointing to a section where the vegetables grew particularly lush. "Can you feel the difference in the ground here?" Eduardo knelt beside her, his expensive clothes already dust-covered from their morning work. He pressed his palms to the earth as she had shown him. "It feels cooler, more alive somehow." "Exactly. The water runs closer to the surface here. My grandfather's maps showed this as one of the spring points." As they knelt side by side, Eduardo became acutely aware of Paloma's presence, the scent of soap and earth that clung to her skin, the careful way she moved her hands across the soil, the intensity of concentration on her face. When she looked up and caught him watching her, both of them felt the electric moment of connection. "Don Eduardo," she said softly, "perhaps we should—" "There you are, Doctor." Harrison's voice cut through the moment like a blade. He approached from the main house, his expression disapproving, as he took in the sight of the estate owner kneeling in the dirt with a servant. "Senor Mendoza, I've been looking for you. We need to discuss the equipment I'll require for proper soil analysis." Eduardo stood, brushing dirt from his hands. "Of course, Doctor. Paloma was just showing me some interesting variations in soil quality." "Yes. Well, Doctor," Harrison said dismissively, "I'm sure the household staff has their observations, but we really must focus on scientific methodology if we're to solve this problem efficiently." As they walked back toward the house, Dr. Harrison continued, "I've been thinking that it might be best to limit the involvement of local workers in our investigation. Too many voices can lead to confusion, and we need absolute precision in our approach." Eduardo glanced back to see Paloma returning to her work, her face carefully neutral, but her posture somehow conveying disappointment. "Doctor, the local knowledge of this land spans generations. Surely there's value in incorporating their insights." "Senor Mendoza, with respect, my methods have transformed agriculture across 3 continents. What we're dealing with here requires expertise that simply cannot be gained through informal observation, regardless of how well-intentioned." The next several days followed a pattern that grew increasingly frustrating for Eduardo. Dr. Harrison conducted elaborate tests, bringing in expensive equipment from Mexico City and spending long hours analyzing soil samples with scientific instruments. His work was undoubtedly thorough and professional, but it yielded little practical insight into why the crops were failing. Meanwhile, Eduardo found himself drawn repeatedly to conversations with Paloma. Under the pretense of learning about her grandfather's methods, he spent hours walking the hacienda with her, listening as she shared the oral history of the land that had been passed down through generations of workers. "Here," she said one afternoon, stopping at a seemingly unremarkable spot in the middle of a failed cornfield. "This is where my grandfather said the main spring used to emerge. Before the earthquake, this was the most fertile ground on the entire hacienda." Eduardo looked around at the barren earth, trying to imagine it as the productive farmland Paloma described. "So what makes you so certain? Look at the trees," she said, pointing to a line of ancient oaks that bordered the field. "See how they grow in a curve. They follow the old path of the underground river." And here, she knelt and brushed away the surface dirt, revealing darker, richer soil beneath. "The earth remembers, even when the water has moved." As she spoke, Eduardo found himself captivated, not just by her knowledge, but by her passion for the land. There was something beautiful about the way she moved through the fields, the reverence with which she touched the earth, the poetry in her descriptions of natural processes. "Paloma," he said impulsively. Where did you learn to see the land this way? She looked up at him, and for a moment, the barriers of class and station seemed to dissolve. My grandfather taught me that the land is alive, Don Eduardo. It has memory, it has needs, it has gifts to offer. But you have to approach it with respect, not just as something to be used. And Dr. Harrison? Dr. Harrison sees the land as a problem to be solved, she said carefully. That's not wrong, but it's incomplete. That evening, Eduardo sat in his study, torn between two very different approaches to saving his hacienda. Dr. Harrison's scientific reports covered his desk, detailed chemical analyses, soil composition charts, and recommendations for expensive treatments that might restore fertility over several growing seasons. But in his jacket pocket, he carried a small piece of paper on which Paloma had sketched the area where she believed the new spring path could be found. Her drawing was simple, but somehow conveyed more hope than all of Dr. Harrison's scientific data. A knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. Adelante? To his surprise, it was Paloma, carrying a tray with his evening meal. Usually, one of the other household staff brought his dinner. Senora Martinez asked me to bring this, she said, setting the tray on a side table. She thought you might prefer not to eat alone in the dining room tonight. Eduardo realized that his housekeeper, who had known him since childhood, was giving him an excuse to spend time with Paloma. Please, sit with me, he said. I'd welcome the company. Paloma hesitated. Don Eduardo, it wouldn't be proper. Paloma, these past few days, walking the fields with you, learning from your grandfather's wisdom. It's meant more to me than all the scientific reports in the world. Please, just for tonight, can we forget about what's proper and simply be two people who care about this land? She sat across from him, her hands folded in her lap, but her eyes meeting his with growing boldness. What will you do about Dr. Harrison's recommendations? His treatments would cost more money than I can afford, and even he admits there's no guarantee they would work. Eduardo pushed the reports aside. But your grandfather's maps suggest a solution that costs nothing but effort and faith. You're thinking of following the spring path. I'm thinking of trusting centuries of accumulated wisdom over a few weeks of laboratory analysis. Paloma's face lit up with excitement. Don Eduardo, if we could find where the water emerges now, we could redirect it back to the fields. It would mean digging channels, building new irrigation systems, but it would work with the land instead of fighting against it, Eduardo finished. They spent the next hour poring over her grandfather's maps, their heads bent close together as they traced the possible paths of the underground streams. Eduardo found himself breathing in the scent of her hair, noticing the delicate curve of her neck, the passionate way she spoke about the land they both loved. Paloma, he said softly, when their planning had evolved into comfortable conversation about their hopes for the hacienda's future. Fiasi, I need you to know that these conversations, this time we've spent together, it's been the brightest part of my days. She looked up at him, and he saw his own feelings reflected in her eyes. Don Eduardo. Eduardo, he corrected gently. When we're alone like this, just call me Eduardo. Eduardo, she repeated, his name soft on her lips. I feel the same way, but we both know that society has rules about people like us, he said. But Paloma, what if society is wrong? What if the only thing that really matters is how two people feel about each other? The question hung in the air between them, dangerous and thrilling. They both knew that a relationship between the wealthy landowner and his servant was not just discouraged, it could destroy both their lives if discovered. I should go, Paloma whispered, but she made no move to leave. Should and want are two different things, Eduardo said. Ares, what do you want? She asked, her voice barely audible. I want to find the springs with you. I want to save this land together, and I want— He reached across the small table and gently touched her hand. I want to see where this feeling between us leads. Paloma's breath caught, but she didn't pull her hand away. And if Dr. Harrison discovers that your grandfather's methods work better than his scientific approach, then perhaps it will be time for Dr. Harrison to learn that wisdom comes in many forms. As if summoned by their conversation, footsteps approached in the hallway outside the study. Paloma quickly withdrew her hand and stood, resuming her formal posture just as Dr. Harrison appeared in the doorway. "Oh, Senor Mendoza," he said, his gaze taking in the scene with obvious disapproval. "I hope I'm not interrupting anything important." "Not at all, Doctor," Eduardo replied smoothly. "Paloma was just clearing away my dinner." "Of course," Dr. Harrison said, though his tone suggested he suspected more than he was saying. "I wanted to discuss my preliminary findings. Perhaps we could speak privately." As Paloma gathered the dishes and left the room, she and Eduardo exchanged a brief but meaningful glance. The investigation into the failing crops had become something much more complex, a battle between different ways of understanding the world and the beginning of a love that defied every rule of their society. The real question was whether they would have the courage to follow their hearts, even if it meant challenging everything they had been taught about their place in the world. Chapter 3. The Confrontation. The third week of Dr. Harrison's investigation brought increasing tension to Hacienda San Miguel. Despite his sophisticated equipment and rigorous testing methods, the Harvard professor had found no definitive solution to the crop failures. His daily reports grew more technical and less hopeful, filled with complex theories that required expensive treatments with uncertain outcomes. Meanwhile, Eduardo found himself spending more and more time with Paloma, ostensibly to understand her grandfather's traditional methods, but increasingly because her presence had become essential to his happiness. Their morning walks through the fields had evolved into long conversations about everything from agricultural philosophy to their dreams for the future. On this particular morning, they stood at the edge of the old chapel ruins, where Paloma's grandfather had believed the earthquake 3 years ago had shifted the underground water flow. The ancient stone structure, built by Spanish missionaries centuries earlier, had been partially collapsed by the tremor, its walls now overgrown with vines and wildflowers. "My grandfather spent his last months here," Paloma said, running her hand along the broken stones. "He said the chapel was built at this exact spot because the monks understood the sacred nature of the springs." Eduardo examined the ruins with new eyes. "Sacred how?" "The indigenous people who lived here before the Spanish considered the springs to be gifts from the earth spirits. When the missionaries came, they built the chapel to, baptize the pagan site, but they kept it in the same location because they recognized its power. And your grandfather believed the earthquake damaged more than just the chapel. He believed it disrupted the spiritual balance of the land itself." Paloma looked slightly embarrassed. "I know that sounds superstitious to someone educated like you." "Paloma," Eduardo said, turning to face her fully, "what if your grandfather was describing something real, but using different language than Dr. Harrison would use? What if the spiritual balance he talked about was actually the ecological balance that modern science is only beginning to understand?" Her eyes widened with surprise and gratitude. "Do you really think there might be wisdom in the old ways?" "I think wisdom can come from anywhere, from Harvard professors or from grandfathers who spent their lives listening to the land." Eduardo stepped closer to her, drawn by the passion in her voice. "And I think you might understand this place better than anyone." As they stood among the chapel ruins, both of them felt the weight of the moment. The physical attraction that had been building between them was undeniable, but it was complicated by the growing intellectual and emotional connection that made their class differences seem increasingly irrelevant. "Eduardo," Paloma said softly, using his given name as he had requested, "there's something I need to tell you about my grandfather's maps." "What is it?" "They show more than just the spring locations. He marked places where he believed we could dig to reconnect the underground flows, but it would require convincing your workers to abandon the current field arrangements and try something completely different." Eduardo considered this. His workers were already struggling with the crop failures, and asking them to undertake a major reorganization based on what Dr. Harrison would dismiss as folklore could be seen as the desperate act of a failing landowner. "Show me," he said simply. They spent the next hour walking through the fields, while Paloma explained her grandfather's vision for redirecting the water flow. Her plan was ambitious but elegant, a series of carefully placed channels and terraces that would guide the underground springs back to the surface where they could nourish the crops. "It would take months of work," she admitted. "And if we're wrong, we're no worse off than we are now," Eduardo said. "But if you're right, we could restore this land without spending a fortune on chemicals and treatments." As they talked, Eduardo found himself increasingly impressed by Paloma's comprehensive understanding of the hacienda's ecosystem. She knew which areas had the best soil drainage, where the wind patterns favored certain crops, which fields had historically been most productive. Her knowledge was vast and practical, gained through years of careful observation rather than academic study. "Paloma," he said as they paused near the main irrigation canal, "I want to try your grandfather's approach. Even though Dr. Harrison will object, especially because Dr. Harrison will object." Eduardo's voice carried a note of frustration. "For 3 weeks, he's been testing and analyzing and theorizing, but he hasn't provided a single practical solution. Your grandfather's maps offer hope." That afternoon, Eduardo called a meeting with his field supervisors, the experienced men who managed the day-to-day agricultural operations of the hacienda. He had known most of them since childhood. Their families had worked alongside his for generations. "Señores," he began, "we all know that Dr. Harrison's scientific methods have not yet yielded the results we hoped for. I want to explore an alternative approach based on traditional knowledge of this land." The supervisors exchanged glances. These were practical men who had watched 3 years of crop failures despite following conventional farming wisdom. "What kind of alternative approach, Patron?" asked Juan Morales, the senior field supervisor. Paloma Herrera has inherited her grandfather's maps and knowledge about the underground springs that used to feed our fields. I want to test her theory that we can restore the water flow by working with the land's natural patterns instead of fighting against them. An uncomfortable silence fell over the group. Finally, Juan spoke carefully. Don Eduardo, with great respect, Joaquin was a good man, but he was not an engineer or a scientist. Are we to abandon proven methods for stories? Juan, our proven methods have failed for 3 consecutive years, Eduardo replied firmly. So I'm not asking you to abandon everything, but I am asking you to consider that wisdom might come from unexpected sources. Before the supervisors could respond, Dr. Harrison entered the room, having apparently overheard the conversation from the hallway. Gentlemen, he said in his accented Spanish, I hope you're not seriously considering abandoning scientific methodology for local folklore. I understand the frustration with our timeline, but these problems require sophisticated solutions. Eduardo felt his patience wearing thin. Doctor, your sophisticated solutions have cost me thousands of pesos and produced no tangible results. At least Paloma's approach offers specific, actionable steps. Paloma? Dr. Harrison's eyebrows rose. Senor Mendoza, surely you're not suggesting that a housemaid is better qualified than a Harvard professor to solve complex agricultural problems? The condescension in his voice sparked something protective in Eduardo. I'm suggesting that someone who has lived her entire life on this land might understand it in ways that laboratory tests cannot measure. This is highly irregular, Dr. Harrison said, his professional composure beginning to crack. I was brought here specifically because of my expertise. If you prefer to follow the advice of uneducated servants, perhaps my services are no longer required. The threat hung in the air. Eduardo knew that dismissing a Harvard professor in favor of a servant's granddaughter would be seen as either desperate or foolish by everyone in his social circle. But as he thought about his morning walks with Paloma, her passionate understanding of the land, and the hope in her voice when she described her grandfather's vision, Eduardo realized that his decision was already made. Dr. Harrison, he said calmly, I appreciate your expertise and the time you've invested in this investigation. However, I've decided to pursue a different approach. I'll be happy to compensate you for your work and arrange transportation back to Mexico City. The professor's face flushed with indignation. This is a serious mistake, Senor Mendoza. You're allowing personal feelings to cloud your business judgment. The comment hit closer to home than Eduardo cared to admit. His growing feelings for Paloma were indeed influencing his decisions, but not in the way Dr. Harrison implied. Her wisdom and insight had earned his respect independent of his romantic interest. My judgment is based on 3 weeks of observation and a lifetime of caring about this land, Eduardo replied. Thank you for your service, Doctor. After Dr. Harrison left, with considerable huffiness and dire predictions about the hacienda's future, Eduardo found himself alone with his field supervisors. The men looked uncomfortable, caught between loyalty to their patron and skepticism about his unconventional decision. Juan, Eduardo said, I know this seems like a risk, but I'm asking you to trust me and to give Paloma's approach a fair trial. If it fails, the responsibility is mine alone. Juan nodded slowly. See, patron, we will follow your lead. That evening, Eduardo found Paloma in the kitchen garden, tending to her vegetables by lamplight. She looked up as he approached, and he could see both hope and apprehension in her expression. Dr. Harrison has returned to Mexico City, he said simply. Paloma's hands stilled on the tomato vines. Because of me, because his methods weren't working, and yours offer our best hope for saving the hacienda. Eduardo sat on the stone bench beside her garden. Paloma, tomorrow we begin following your grandfather's maps. Are you ready for that responsibility? She set down her gardening tools and turned to face him fully. Eduardo, what you're doing, choosing traditional knowledge over university science, trusting a servant over a professor. People will say you've lost your mind. People already think I've lost my mind, he said with a wry smile. 3 years of crop failures will do that to a landowner's reputation. But if we're wrong, if my grandfather's maps don't lead us to the springs, then we'll face that together, Eduardo said, reaching for her hand. Paloma, what's happening between us? It's not just about the land anymore. I'm falling in love with you. The words hung between them in the lamplight, dangerous and wonderful. Paloma's breath caught, and when she spoke, her voice was barely a whisper. I'm falling in love with you too. But Eduardo, the world will never accept us. A landowner and his maid. The world changes when people have the courage to challenge it, he said. And maybe it's time for someone to prove that love and wisdom can come from anywhere, regardless of what society expects. As they sat together in the garden, surrounded by the thriving plants that grew where ancient springs had once flowed, both of them knew they were about to embark on the greatest risk of their lives, not just the attempt to save the hacienda, but the choice to follow their hearts despite every social convention that said their love was impossible. Tomorrow, they would begin digging for springs that might not exist, guided by maps drawn by a man who learned about the land through story and spirit, rather than science and analysis, but tonight they allowed themselves to believe that sometimes the most important discoveries came not from prestigious universities, but from understanding the deeper truths that connected people to the earth and to each other. Chapter 4. The Miraculous Discovery. Dawn broke misty and cool over Hacienda San Miguel, the kind of morning that promised a scorching day once the sun climbed higher. Eduardo stood at the edge of the main courtyard, watching as his workers assembled with shovels, picks, and surveying equipment. Today they would either begin the salvation of his family's legacy or embark on an expensive folly that would cement his reputation as a landowner who had lost his way. Paloma approached from the direction of the chapel ruins, carrying her grandfather's maps wrapped in oiled cloth. She wore a practical work dress and had braided her hair securely, ready for a day of physical labor alongside the men. Her presence caused murmurs among the workers. It was highly unusual for a house servant to direct field operations. "Buenos dias," Eduardo called to the assembled group. "Today we begin something different. Some of you may have doubts about our approach, and that's understandable, but I ask for your patience and your best effort." Juan Morales stepped forward. "Where do we start, Patron?" Eduardo looked to Paloma, making it clear that she would be directing the operation. "Señorita Herrera will guide us based on her grandfather's research." Paloma unrolled the maps on a wooden table that had been brought from the house. The hand-drawn charts showed the hacienda from a perspective none of the modern surveys had captured, not just the surface features, but the underground flows that connected seemingly unrelated areas. "My grandfather believed the main spring flow was disrupted here," she said, pointing to an area near the chapel ruins. "But the water didn't disappear. It found a new path. According to his calculations, it should emerge somewhere in this region." She indicated a section of apparently barren ground, about half a kilometer from the original spring location. "How can we find the exact spot?" asked Miguel Santos. "We look for the signs," Paloma replied. "Different vegetation patterns, cooler ground temperature, changes in soil composition. My grandfather taught me that the earth always reveals its secrets to those who know how to observe." For the next 2 hours, Paloma led small groups of workers across the indicated area, teaching them to feel for subtle differences in the ground, to look for plants that grew differently, to notice variations that might indicate underground water. Eduardo followed her, marveling at her ability to read the landscape like a book written in a language only she understood. "Here," she said finally, stopping at a spot that looked identical to every other patch of ground they had examined. "This is where we dig." The workers looked skeptical. Juan Morales knelt and felt the earth, finding it as dry and hard as anywhere else in the failed fields. "Señorita Paloma," he said respectfully, "this ground seems no different from the rest." "It isn't different on the surface," she replied, "but my grandfather's map shows that the underground flow should be closest to the surface at this point. We need to dig down about 2 meters. Eduardo nodded to Juan, who organized the workers into digging teams. As the first shovelfuls of earth were removed, Eduardo found himself holding his breath. Everything, his reputation, his family's future, and his growing relationship with Paloma, depended on what they would find beneath this unremarkable patch of ground. The work was hard and slow. The earth was packed solid from years of drought, and the sun grew mercilessly hot as the morning progressed. After an hour of digging, they had reached only half a meter depth, with no sign of water or even moist soil. "Patron," one of the workers called out, wiping sweat from his brow. "Perhaps we should try a different location." Eduardo looked at Paloma, who was studying her grandfather's map with intense concentration. He could see doubt beginning to creep into her expression, and his heart ached for her. "Continue digging," he said firmly. "We trust the map." By noon, they had reached nearly 2 meters with still no sign of water. The workers were exhausted, and Eduardo could hear whispered conversations about the folly of following a dead man's dreams. Even Paloma looked discouraged, though she tried to hide her growing anxiety. "Eduardo," she said quietly, pulling him aside. "Perhaps my grandfather was wrong. Perhaps the earthquake changed more than we understood." "Paloma, we knew this was a risk," he replied, taking her hands in his. "But I believe in your grandfather's wisdom, and I believe in you." Just then, a shout erupted from the excavation site. "Agua! Agua!" Eduardo and Paloma rushed to the edge of the pit to see dark, moist soil at the bottom of the hole. As they watched, a thin trickle of clear water began to seep through the earth, gradually forming a small pool at the bottom of their excavation. The workers cheered, and Eduardo felt tears of relief and joy running down his face, but his greatest joy came from seeing Paloma's expression, the mixture of vindication, gratitude, and pure happiness that transformed her features. "Your grandfather was right," he said, pulling her into an embrace that felt natural despite the watching eyes of his workers. He always said the water would return when someone listened carefully enough, she replied, her voice choked with emotion. Over the next several days, the discovery of the spring transformed the entire atmosphere of the hacienda. Working from Paloma's maps, they located 2 additional water sources and began the careful work of digging channels and building simple irrigation systems to direct the water to the failing fields. Paloma worked alongside the men, her hands as dirty and calloused as any field workers, her knowledge proving invaluable in determining the most efficient ways to move the water. Eduardo found himself in the unprecedented position of taking direction from his maid and discovering that he didn't care what anyone thought about the arrangement. The old irrigation channels can be restored, Paloma explained one afternoon as they surveyed the progress. My grandfather's notes show that the original system was designed to work with the natural flow of all 7 springs. If we can find and reconnect them, the entire hacienda can be productive again. How long will it take? Eduardo asked. Months of work, she admitted. But, Eduardo, the cost will be almost nothing except labor. No expensive chemicals, no imported equipment, just working with the land instead of against it. As the weeks passed, their success became undeniable. The first fields to receive water from the restored springs began showing new growth within days. The cornstalks that had been brown and withered started turning green, and new shoots emerged from ground that had seemed completely barren. Word of their unconventional success spread throughout the region. Other landowners began arriving to see the miraculous recovery of Hacienda San Miguel, and many left with copies of Joaquin Herrera's techniques for reading the land. But the success also intensified the scrutiny of Eduardo and Paloma's relationship. It was impossible to hide the fact that the estate owner was taking direction from a servant, spending long hours alone with her and looking at her with obvious affection. People are talking, Miguel Santos warned Eduardo one evening. They say you've become obsessed with the girl. People always talk, Eduardo replied. What matters is that we're saving the hacienda. But Eduardo, you must consider your position in society. A man of your standing cannot be seen as what? As someone who recognizes wisdom wherever he finds it. As someone who values intelligence over social position. Miguel looked uncomfortable. As someone who has fallen in love with his maid. The words hung between them, the truth finally spoken aloud. Eduardo didn't deny it, couldn't deny it, even if he wanted to. Miguel, what if I have? What if I've found a woman who understands me, who shares my passion for this land, who has saved my family's legacy? Should I reject that because of what other people might think? You're talking about marriage, Miguel said quietly. I'm talking about love, Eduardo corrected. And yes, if Paloma will have me, I'm talking about marriage. Chapter 5. Love conquers all the day. Eduardo Mendoza announced his intention to marry Paloma Herrera. The social earthquake that followed could be felt throughout all of Jalisco. In the elegant salons of Guadalajara, in the drawing rooms of Mexico City's finest families, and in the cantinas where working men gathered after long days in the fields, the news was discussed with equal measures of shock, admiration, and scandal. Has the man completely lost his senses? Demanded Doña Isabella Castellanos, one of the most influential society matrons in the region. To throw away centuries of family prestige for a servant girl, it's unthinkable. But even as the wealthy elite expressed their outrage, something remarkable was happening among the common people throughout the valley. The story of how Paloma's traditional knowledge had saved Hacienda San Miguel and how her employer had fallen in love with her wisdom and character rather than her social position was spreading from village to village like wildfire. Eduardo was well aware of the controversy he had created, but he found that he cared less about social approval with each passing day. The success of the spring restoration project had not only brought prosperity back to his lands, but had also brought him a partner whose intelligence and insight continued to amaze him daily. The Hernandez family wants to visit next week, he told Paloma one morning, as they walked through fields that were now lush and green again. And their hacienda has been struggling with similar problems, and they want to learn your grandfather's methods. Paloma smiled, still somewhat amazed by the transformation in her circumstances. 6 months ago, she had been a household servant whose opinions were dismissed as folklore. Now she was consulted as an expert by some of the wealthiest landowners in Mexico. Do you think they'll listen to me? She asked. A woman who never attended university. I think they'll listen to someone who has proven that wisdom comes from understanding the land, not from textbooks, Eduardo replied. Paloma, you're changing the way people think about agriculture throughout the region. As they spoke, a carriage approached along the main road to the hacienda. Eduardo shaded his eyes, trying to identify the visitors, then sighed deeply. Who is it? Paloma asked. My cousin Ricardo from Mexico City. And from the look of the fancy carriage, he's brought the entire family council with him. Don Ricardo Mendoza Mendoza was everything Eduardo had once been expected to become, a sophisticated urban gentleman with extensive business interests and connections to the highest levels of Mexican society. He stepped from the carriage wearing an expensive suit and an expression of barely concealed disapproval, followed by three other well-dressed relatives who looked like they were attending a funeral. "Eduardo," Ricardo said, embracing his cousin with cold formality. "We've come to discuss this situation before you make any irreversible mistakes." Ricardo, what a surprise. "I wish you had sent word. We wanted to see for ourselves what all the scandal is about." Ricardo's gaze fell on Paloma, taking in her simple dress and work-roughened hands. "And this, I assume, is the famous Señorita Herrera." Paloma curtsied respectfully, but Eduardo noticed the way Ricardo's companions looked at her with poorly concealed disdain. "Paloma, may I present my cousin, Don Ricardo Mendoza, and our relatives from the capital," Eduardo said formally, his voice carefully controlled. "Señores," Paloma acknowledged quietly, maintaining her dignity despite the obvious hostility. "So," Ricardo said, turning back to Eduardo, "these are the miraculous agricultural innovations that have caused such excitement. And this young woman is responsible for them." Paloma's knowledge of traditional water management techniques has transformed our productivity, Eduardo replied, his protective instincts rising. "Traditional techniques," Ricardo repeated with a slight smile. "How quaint, Eduardo. Might we speak privately about the family's concerns?" They walked toward the house, leaving Paloma standing with the workers who had gathered to watch the confrontation. Eduardo could see the discomfort on her face and felt a surge of anger at his relative's arrogance. In Eduardo's study, Ricardo wasted no time in getting to the point. "Eduardo, the family is deeply concerned about your recent decisions. First, this business with dismissing a Harvard professor, and now these rumors about your engagement to a servant girl. The rumors are true," Eduardo said calmly. "Paloma and I plan to marry." "Eduardo!" exclaimed his elderly aunt, Doña Carmen. "You cannot be serious. The Mendoza name has stood for something in this country for over 2 centuries. We cannot allow it to be diminished by this romantic foolishness." "My reputation has been enhanced by the success of this hacienda," Eduardo replied firmly. "And my engagement to Paloma is hardly foolishness. She's the most intelligent and capable woman I've ever known. She's a servant, Eduardo," Ricardo said bluntly. "A pretty servant, perhaps, but still a servant. There are appropriate ways to handle such attractions without destroying your social standing." Eduardo felt his temper rising dangerously. "Appropriate ways? You mean keep her as a mistress while marrying someone of appropriate social class for the family's benefit? I mean, remember who you are and what you owe to your family's legacy," Ricardo replied coldly. "I owe my family's legacy its survival," Eduardo said, his voice rising, "which Paloma has ensured through her knowledge and wisdom. Without her, this hacienda would be bankrupt, and the Mendoza name would be associated with failure rather than success." Their heated conversation was interrupted by a commotion from the courtyard outside. Through the window, Eduardo could see a crowd gathering around something or someone near the main fountain. They hurried outside to find Paloma surrounded by a group that included not only Eduardo's field workers and their families, but also visitors from neighboring haciendas. She was explaining the principles behind the spring restoration, using a stick to draw diagrams in the dirt as she spoke, her voice clear and confident despite the hostile presence of Eduardo's relatives. "The key is understanding that water always wants to flow downhill and find the easiest path," she was saying. "When we work against its natural tendency, we create problems that seem impossible to solve. But when we help it follow its intended course, it brings life to everything it touches." One of the visiting landowners asked, "But how do you find these underground paths without expensive equipment and university training?" "You learn to read the signs that have always been there," Paloma replied. "The way certain plants grow, the feel of the earth under your feet, the stories passed down by people who have worked the land for generations. My grandfather taught me that the earth speaks to those who know how to listen, and that this knowledge belongs to everyone, not just to those who can afford formal education." Eduardo watched Ricardo's face as Paloma spoke. Despite his obvious prejudices, his cousin was clearly impressed by her articulate explanations and comprehensive understanding of agricultural principles. "She's quite, knowledgeable," Ricardo admitted grudgingly to Eduardo. "Where exactly did she receive her education?" "From her grandfather, from the land itself, and from paying careful attention to the world around her," Eduardo replied. "They're the most important education anyone can receive." As the crowd around Paloma continued to grow, with people asking increasingly sophisticated questions about soil management, water conservation, and sustainable farming practices, it became clear that she was not simply repeating traditional methods, but truly understanding and adapting them to solve and temporary problems. Señorita Herrera, said Don Carlos Hernandez, the owner of a struggling hacienda to the south, my grandfather often spoke of methods similar to what you describe, but we lost that knowledge when we modernized our operations. Would you be willing to visit our property and help us rediscover what we've forgotten? I would be honored, Paloma replied. Traditional knowledge belongs to everyone. It shouldn't be lost because we become too proud to learn from our ancestors. By the end of the afternoon, 5 different landowners had requested Paloma's consultation, and even Ricardo seemed thoughtful rather than dismissive. As the visitors prepared to leave, Ricardo pulled Eduardo aside one final time. Your Paloma is extraordinary, he admitted reluctantly. But Eduardo, you must understand that marrying her will close certain doors for you. Society can be cruel to those who challenge its conventions, and it can be transformative for those brave enough to lead by example. Eduardo replied firmly. Ricardo, what if our marriage helps other people realize that wisdom and worth have nothing to do with the circumstances of one's birth? And what if it simply makes you both outcasts from the only society you've ever known? Eduardo looked across the courtyard to where Paloma was saying goodbye to the visiting families, her face glowing with the satisfaction of having helped solve real problems for real people. Then we'll be outcasts who have made a difference, he said. And I can think of worse fates than that. 2 months later, on a perfect October morning when the restored fields stretched green and abundant under the autumn sun, Eduardo Mendoza and Paloma Herrera were married in the renovated chapel at Hacienda San Miguel. The ceremony was unlike any the region had ever seen, attended by both wealthy landowners and field workers, celebrated with traditional Mexican music and food that reflected the cultural heritage both bride and groom had learned to honor. As they exchanged vows in the same chapel where Paloma's grandfather had first understood the secret of the underground springs, both of them knew they were creating something new, not just a marriage, but a partnership that would continue transforming the way people thought about knowledge, value, and the possibilities for love to transcend every barrier society could create. The Harvard professor had been dismissed and forgotten, but the true education had just begun. And the maid who had solved the problem would spend the rest of her life proving that sometimes the most important discoveries come not from prestigious institutions, but from listening carefully to the wisdom that surrounds us every day, waiting to be heard by those brave enough to trust that truth comes in many forms. As the celebration continued late into the night, with music and dancing under the stars that shone down on the miraculous fields of Hacienda San Miguel, Eduardo and Paloma knew that their greatest adventure was just beginning. Building a life together that honored both tradition and progress, that valued both innovation and ancient wisdom, and that proved every day that love really could change the world, one restored spring at a time. The end. Thank you for joining us on this incredible journey through the heart of Mexico, where love bloomed between two people brave enough to challenge every convention of their time. If this story touched your heart and made you believe in the power of true love to overcome any obstacle, please give this video a huge thumbs up and subscribe to our channel for more amazing romantic stories from around the world. We'd love to hear from you in the comments. Did Eduardo and Paloma's love story inspire you? Do you believe that wisdom can come from the most unexpected places? And most importantly, where are you watching from today? Whether you're in Mexico, the United States, Spain, or anywhere else in our beautiful world, let us know in the comments below. Don't forget to ring that notification bell so you never miss our latest stories of love, courage, and the incredible things that happen when people follow their hearts, despite what society tells them is impossible. Until next time, keep believing in love that transforms not just two hearts, but the entire world around them.